Hello, and welcome to the Rossaround Backstage Podcast, talking with artists, technicians, musicians, producers, directors, and all the interesting and talented people that make it all happen for you. Hi, everybody. This is Ross Pallone with the Rossaround Backstage Podcast, and I'm here today at my home studio out in Thousand Oaks, California, with engineer, producer, and guitar player Steve Sykes. So, Steve, tell me how you got into this business.
Well, first, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
How are you?
Thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. That's great. Well, let's see. At the beginning, we'll talk about, I guess, childhood, huh?
Yeah. How did things get rolling for you? What made you get interested in music?
Well, let's start with the fact that my mom was a fairly well-known jazz booking agent in Philadelphia, and I grew up being able to listen to all these jazz greats that my mom would take me to go hear. Actually, we had people audition in our living room when I was a child, like Nina Simone at one point came and auditioned on our piano when I was a little toddler. And my mom used to take me to see Buddy Rich, and we used to go to New York to go see Lionel Hampton and Gene Krupa.
Wow.
I saw Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. This is all going on when I was, under 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And
you were living where?
In Philadelphia.
Philadelphia,
yeah. So I couldn't help but be immersed in it, from the time I was very small. And about 8 years, at 8 years old, I decided I wanted to be a musician too, and decided I wanted to be a guitar player. And I remember my mom went out and got me a guitar and got me lessons, and I took a couple of lessons and just hated it.
Didn't like being told what to do, huh?
I hated it. So I went back to playing and hanging out, playing stickball with my buddies in the street. And a few years later, when I heard the Beatles, it was like, okay, that's it. I'm going to do this again. That was it. That's when I had to.
They were your main inspiration.
Yeah, the Beatles, and I think there was a record called "He's a Rebel." Remember "He's a Rebel"?
Yeah,
yeah. And all the Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons records, we're talking, 1961, 62, 63, right around that area. And I got really inspired by, pop music on the AM radio, and decided to become a guitar player for real. And then I was self-taught. So I've been self-taught my whole life, actually.
Oh, so you never went back to the lessons?
Never went back to the lessons. However, later on, I kind of regretted it, but I did a lot of book study on my own. I just, I was, as a kid, I thought that I was wrong about it, but I thought that having lessons as a guitar player when I was an adolescent was kind of like having a disciplinarian, which I always rebelled against. So I decided to just do the lessons on my own. And went on. I started a band when I was 13 years old, and the band was called The Thorns. And I remember we went into the studio in Philadelphia. It was a studio called Sound Plus, and I don't remember the name of the engineer at that point, but
you probably didn't even realize
I didn't
what
even
an
know
engineer
what engineering was,
yeah,
right, at that point, at 13. And I remember going in, and we cut these two sides at that point, and I was just thrilled listening to the sound coming back out of the speakers. It was like the most amazing thing I had ever heard.
Uh-huh.
I heard reverb for the first time.
Right.
And knocked me over.
Now, were you were you the principal person in the
band?
You were the guitar player? You were the singer too?
I was the lead singer too. It was the last time I ever sang, actually. I didn't have much talent as a vocalist. But at any rate, that studio, Sound Plus in Philadelphia, later on became known as Sigma Sound.
Oh, yeah.
Where all those great Philly records came out of. My God, the Spinners, the OJs, the Delphonics, all those great records came out of there. And Tom Bell, that became his home, his home base for making all those great records. at any rate, and then I went on and kept playing around town and did various blues bands and things like that, and wound up in a band with a guy named Nick Jameson. I don't know whether you ever knew Nick Jameson.
No,
he
doesn't sound familiar.
We then had a band called The Fine Stuff, and we cut more stuff together at Cameo Parkway Studios in Philadelphia, and nothing ever really happened, but we were just having a great time as teenage band guys. It was just a whole lot of fun, and there were great years to live through in the 60s in Philly.
Yeah.
And later on, I wound up in this band that got signed to Atlantic, and that was in the 60s, called Sweet Stave and Chain. And we got signed by Ahmet Ertegun to Atlantic. Actually, the label was Cotillion at that point. And we put out an album that Gene Paul, Les Paul's son, engineered.
Oh.
And we had one notable single off that album called Teddy Bear's Picnic.
And the band, say the name of the band again?
The band was called Sweet Stavin Chain.
Stavin.
Stavin, Stavin.
Oh, okay.
And it was a lyric from a Robert Johnson song.
Oh, okay.
You know, it was a real blues band. And nothing really happened with that either. You know, labels were signing millions of bands at that point in history in the music business. And my buddy Nick Jameson went on to start a band called American Dream that got signed by Albert Grossman, I guess, at that point. And he moved to Woodstock and started working with Todd Rundgren at that point. And I'm sure you know Todd, right?
Of course,
yeah.
Sure.
And I basically stayed around Philadelphia doing different things, and there's some interesting history right around there. I hooked up with a producer named John Madera, who started calling me to do some guitar stuff for him right around then at Sigma Sound. And the players he would call were me, John Oates, and Daryl Hall. And of course, you know what those guys became.
Oh, yeah.
And we were actually, the session that we did together was for a singer named Brian England that John Madera was producing at that point. And it was one of my early forays into the studio as like a studio guitar player guy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was when they were doing like everything live. It was like we had like 4 acoustic guitar players, 2 electric guitar players, drums, pianos, just everything going on at once, vocals, strings, horns, everything, at Sigma. And that's not that big of a room, actually, to do all that, but that's how we were doing it then. So at any rate, that was John Madera, just to give you a little history of who he was, and still is, of course. He's still alive and a dear friend. He was in a band called Danny and the Juniors. He wrote the song At the Hop. Remember At the Hop?
At the Hop.
Yeah. And Madera wrote At the Hop. He also wrote the song You Don't Own Me, Leslie Gore, remember?
Sure,
and
I remember that
so
one. Mm-hmm.
He was a pretty influential guy at that point, and I'm honored to have him as a buddy till this day. He's up in San Luis Obispo at this point. But at any rate, I kicked around and played around Philadelphia, as a guitar player, doing various gigs, and I went out on tour with Screamin' Jay Hawkins. Going to put a spell on you. Me and the other guys in the band, we used to carry him out on stage in a coffin, and we were the pallbearers, and he would jump out of his coffin with a flaming skull on a stick. That was all part of the show.
Wow.
And also during that time, I backed up Moms Mabley, the comedian. Remember her?
Yeah.
And I pretty much, did most of the stuff you could do in Philadelphia. It just wasn't a place for me to stay. I decided I wanted to move to L.A.
So you were a big fish in a small pond.
Well, I don't know if I was a big fish. I was a fish.
Yeah, you were getting there. Well, you'd gone as far as you thought that you could go.
As far as I thought I could go, It's amazing. There's certain people I never met in Philly, like Jeff Lorber, for example. He and I never met. We were just, different parts of town. Philadelphia's a pretty big city. As I told you earlier, I think before the interview started, I'll reiterate now, I went to high school with Stanley Clark, and we played together in the school jazz band. Mm-hmm. And then we had a band outside of high school called the Blues Demonstration, he and I. And of course, Stanley went on to be a big bass star.
Oh, yeah.
And we actually wound up working together later here in L.A., later in life on films together. Mm-hmm. But I left Philadelphia, packed up everything I owned in my Volkswagen bus, and started driving west. This was 1969, 70, right around then. Mm-hmm. And I was headed to L.A. I got to Colorado and stopped for lunch in Denver, actually, one of my stops. And those were the days when as a musician, in order to find a gig as a musician, you would look in music stores on billboards.
Yeah.
And there'd be all this, drummer wanted, guitar player needed, or
with the little tabs,
little tabs, yeah,
phone number,
right, exactly.
And you call.
Yeah, because there was no,
no
you
internet.
either looked in the want ads in the newspaper. There's no internet.
Yeah.
Nobody had cell phones or anything. So that's how you would find gigs. Well, at any rate, just for curiosity, stopping for lunch, I got out of my bus. There was this music store called Music City in Denver on Colfax Avenue. I walked in and started looking around just for fun. Decided to start noodling on a guitar in the corner. I hadn't played a guitar in a while. I'd been traveling, and I was used to practicing every day at that point. As I was noodling on guitar, these two guys walked in that heard me playing and wanted to know if I would sit in with their band that night. And these two guys that walked in were Philip Bailey and Larry Dunn.
Oh.
And
from Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Yeah, exactly. Long before Earth, Wind, and Fire was formed.
Yeah.
And this is 1970 now. And I said, sure, why not? That'd be great. I had nothing else to do. I was just some hippie traveling across country.
Right.
I sat in with them that night at their gig, and the rest was history for me, actually. We decided to, become a band, and the band was called Friends and Love, named after a Chuck Mangione album.
So you stopped your
I
trek
stopped my
to California.
Trek to L.A., yeah.
Yeah.
I stopped and stayed in Denver, and we became the hottest band in Denver. We were on fire. What a killer band. At any rate, so I was the guitar player. I had a sax player that I called to come out and join us named Greg Scott from Philadelphia, and he was with us for a while. The band consisted now of myself, Larry Dunn, Philip Bailey, another singer named Carl Carwell, a bass player named Hilliard Wilson, and a drummer named Larry Thompson. And we were just burning. We had lines around the block to come see us.
What kind of music were you doing?
It was kind of like a few originals, but mainly, covers of, the latest funk that was happening then.
So it was mostly funk type music?
Mostly funk, R&B.
Soul, yeah.
Yeah, soul stuff. We were also in the studio. We had become like a jingle band. Actually, a jingle studio band. We were learning to play in the studio for real at that point. We got real serious about it. That went on later. But a fateful night, I'll fast forward a little bit, we started getting very popular, as I said. We got this one gig one night to open a show for a band called Earth, Wind, and Fire that was passing through town. Now, this band consisted of, the only guy I remember the name of at that point was Maurice White. But it was a completely different lineup of Earth, Wind, and Fire coming from Chicago. They had two horns, I believe, trombone and sax. They had a girl singer. And I'm pretty sure Verdine White was the bass player at that point from the beginning with Maurice. At any rate, we opened for them, Friends in Love, and nobody could touch us, including Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Really?
Half the audience left after our show because we exhausted them.
Wow, I bet you weren't popular with Earth, Wind, and Fire. Then.
Well, we were popular, and don't forget, Maurice White was a very smart businessman and a very talented guy.
Yeah.
And he recognized right away the value of Larry Dunn and Philip Bailey. Okay.
Yeah.
And made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Well, that was the end of our band, Friends in Love.
And kind of the beginning of Earth,
And the
Wind, and
beginning
Fire.
of the real Earth, Wind, and Fire
Yeah.
that everybody knows
Because
today.
Philip probably took the place of the female singer.
Yes, probably so. Yeah, yeah. At any rate, they joined up with Maurice within the next week, and we were kind of left high and dry without Philip or Larry. Larry was our B3, Hammond organ guy. So we kind of decided that we wanted to actually retreat and be a real studio band at that point. And we started doing jingle after jingle for a producer named Dick Darnell that was working in Denver. And it was really the best thing that could have happened to me at that point, because I really started getting my reading together as a player. And that's what, mind you, Ross, I did not know about engineering. To me, engineers were the guys in white coats that just got in the way of the music.
Uh-huh.
That's how I thought of engineers at that. Ashamed to say it now as a full working engineer, but that's what I thought then.
Yeah.
In my early
see that.
20s, So we were doing all sorts of stuff. We were doing bank jingles. We were doing Frontier Airlines was one of the accounts we had, and that's when I got to exercise all the stuff I had learned out of reading my Berklee School of Music books. Although never being a student at Berklee, I certainly read a lot of the information from the school, and I read about conducting and. This guy, Dick Darnell, he threw me in the deep water, in the deep end. I wound up conducting members of the Denver Symphony doing jingles, and I was writing the scores out.
Wow. That's quite a jump into the deep end.
Oh, it was really jumping in the deep end, considering, a self-taught guy. I taught myself to read music. I taught myself to write music, without any tutors. Actually, I skipped a very influential guy. Now, you told me we're going to go linear on this.
Well, as much as you can, but,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay.
You go back? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll go back very briefly. There was a bass player that worked for my mom when I was a young teenager. His name was Skeets McLean. He was one of the early bass players that played in the Ray Charles band. He was the guy that really, really influenced me to learn to read music on my own, whether I had a teacher or not. And so that's just jumping back real briefly.
Okay, sure.
And he was the guy, the real influence on me to really get serious about being a musician if I was going to really be one, and learn to read music and go all the way and be a writer and composer and learn how to write it out for people.
Uh-huh.
At any rate, okay, that's as far as I'll backtrack on
I
him.
gotcha.
But at any rate, so during this time, early 70s in Denver, we stayed alive by doing radio jingles. And occasionally we would go out and do the live gig, doing cover tunes as a band. And the bass player, Hilliard, stayed with us. He didn't move to L.A. He stayed in Denver, and the drummer stayed as well. Great drummer, bass player team. We also had this guy named Al Campbell that played keyboards with us. And Hilliard's wife became the singer, Lana Wilson. And so those were the gigs we did to stay alive, and we just basically kicked around and did a lot of studio work. And before you know it, we ran into this guy named Gerard McMahon, who was a great, great songwriter, brilliant songwriter. And we started working with him in the studio, and we became an act. And the act became called the Family Circle of Music. And again, we rose to the top in Denver of all the live performing acts. And we got signed by Jimmy Guercio at Caribou Ranch, who was the manager of and producer of Chicago, as you probably already know. You've probably had dealings with some of these guys.
I actually haven't.
You haven't? Okay.
No, I never knew them.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, at any rate, After it was about 3 or 4 years in the studio before we became a serious live band again, after the departure of Philip Bailey and Larry Dunn.
Yeah.
And this time we had a new front guy, Gerard McMahon. We were playing all over town. And again, we started packing the places, and we were doing all original material, and got signed to Gercio, to CBS. We made an album at Caribou. We lived up there. We moved up there. The whole band lived at Caribou. And we made an album with Jimmy Pankow and Walt Parazeta. And they kind of supplemented our horn section. So we had the Chicago horns with our horn section on the album.
Nice.
And the album was simply titled Gerard.
Now, was this another funk?
No, this
R&B
was like a pop, real pop album. And of course it was, I've been like bands that almost happened my whole life, but never
the
quite
bridesmaid.
did. Yeah, never quite did, but that's okay. Yeah. It's a lifetime of wonderful experiences.
Well, yeah, I've got some of those stories myself.
I should have been in the movie Almost Famous.
Right. Now, did the record come out?
The record came out on CBS. And nothing ever happened with it. We did some big touring with it, though. We were the opening act for the Beach Boys Chicago Fleetwood Mac 1975.
Wow.
We did Anaheim Stadium. We did Denver Mile High Stadium. We did tons of stadiums, and during those days, I was pretty stoned, so I don't remember everywhere we played. To be quite honest, we did a lot of gigs.
The 70s, yeah.
The 70s, yeah. We did a lot of big concerts, though. Big, major shows.
Cool. Well, that's a great.
Yeah,
that's a great memory, isn't it?
Yeah. We were managed and signed by Caribou Records, Caribou Ranch, and Jimmy Gercio, which is how we were able to do all those big shows.
Yeah.
Because he was kind of like top of the heap at that point in music history, Gercio. Mm-hmm. He also produced Blood, Sweat, and Tears as well.
Oh.
Before Chicago. I don't know and he produced the Buckinghams. Remember the Buckinghams?
Yeah, I remember them too. Sure.
Yeah.
So
we were so honored to be signed by him.
Oh, yeah.
At that point. At any rate, there was another band that nothing ever really happened with.
Right.
Basically, we came off tour and then went back to playing local clubs in Denver again. Gerard, actually, being a very prolific songwriter, he wound up moving to L.A. I still stayed in Denver, started doing gigs there. It was kind of sad how it ended. How it ended is we were told. I don't know if this should be in the podcast or not, but you'll edit and decide.
Okay.
After we did the last gig, we were playing at the Schaefer Festival in New York at Central Park, and we were told by the management, "Listen, we're going to do the European leg of the tour. So come back to Colorado. We're going to rehearse for a couple of weeks, and then we're going to go to Europe and do more touring as an opening act." So we came back to Denver, and when we came back to Denver, I found out that I was not allowed back at Caribou Ranch again. The band had been fired. And the last paycheck we had received a couple of weeks prior was the last paycheck. Oh. And we were just left high and dry to fend for ourselves. And that was the end of it. It was just over. And Gerard was still being supported by Caribou because he was the songwriter.
Yeah.
And he moved to L.A. And we were just like the expendable players.
Right.
So at that point, I became homeless and on food stamps and sleeping in my car with a wife and a under 1-year-old infant.
Oh, no.
And in Denver in the winter.
Yeah, it gets cold there.
Yes, it gets cold.
Yeah.
And so I truly was homeless during that year, 76. We beat her. I was doing odd jobs. I was working at Manpower at 6 a.m. I don't know if you know. Manpower is basically day labor work. And I was waiting in the mornings to make my $12 a day to basically bust rocks all day. I did that for, a few months while still living in the car as well, and camping, making campfires so we could cook at night. And I had a few friends that were kind enough to take us in the evenings. During the nights, we didn't have to stay out in the cold. And eventually, I kept looking for work, day jobs, because basically I didn't have any guitar work during that time. And I finally got a job at a place called the Bagel Deli as a short order sandwich guy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I had been working there. I'm going to fast forward a bit. I was so thrilled to get a job, and I was able to get us a house to rent because all of a sudden I have a job now. That's when you could actually have a job as a single minimum wage guy and actually support your family a little bit.
Yeah, you could get by.
Yeah, you could get by.
Yeah.
So, after living in the car, this was like a godsend. This was wonderful. So I wound up working at this deli with a little white hat on. Mm-hmm. And about a week and a half into the job, I was being taught how to slice pastrami and corned beef on the meat slicer, with the circular blade. And I wasn't paying close enough attention, and I was slicing a piece of pastrami or corned beef, I forget which it was, and I was going zip, 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 and all of a sudden I went down too far and sliced all 4 tips of my fingers on my left hand off on the meat slicer. And there's blood everywhere, and little flaps on my fingertips are hanging, and I'm like, oh no, what have I done? And they wrapped me up, wrapped my hand up, and carted me off to an emergency room where they sewed my fingertips back on and put my whole hand in a big bandage. And I came back to work a couple of hours later, back to the deli, and basically I was lucky to still keep my job.
Yeah.
But I had only had it a week when I sliced the tips of my fingers. Now here I'm thinking, okay, my heart's sinking because I figure I'm a guitar player. I lost the tips of my fingers just now, the fretting hand. Well, to make matters worse, and believe me, this is not a sob story. Let me tell you the caveat up front. This is not a sob story. This is the God's honest truth I'm telling you. About an hour and a half after I'm back at the deli, the payphone rings in the deli, and one of the waitresses comes over to me and says, "Steve, it's for you." I'm like, who the hell would call me on a payphone at a deli I work at? Well, it just so happens I had befriended a bass player named Kenny Passarelli, during my time at Caribou. I actually played guitar on his solo album. Kenny Passarelli, do you know who he is at all?
Don't know.
Passarelli was a bass player on Joe Walsh's Barnstorm.
Oh.
He also, at that time, he had just gotten the gig playing bass with Hall & Oates, who had just had their first big hit single, Sarah's Smile.
Mm-hmm.
And Passarelli found out somehow, I have to talk to Kenny. I got to call him. He somehow found out I was working at a deli, and he had just gotten the bass gig, and Daryl and John Oates for sure. I didn't know Daryl very well, but I knew John Oates from our sessions in Philadelphia, backtracking to John Madera now. Mm-hmm. And they thought I would be the perfect guitar player to go out and go on tour with Hall & Oates for the first tour.
Wow.
So the manager at that point, Tommy Mottola, was calling on the payphone to the deli, and he offered me an undisclosed amount of money, which I won't say, but it was a fortune to me. And could I be in New York by Friday to start rehearsals for the new Hall & Oates tour?
Wow.
Well, my heart sank even further because I had to turn it down. Because my hand was in a bandage and I didn't know if I would ever play guitar again in my life, let alone on the Hall & Oates tour.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the little sad story of how I lost the Hall & Oates tour.
Yeah, that's a bummer. Yeah.
Okay.
Great timing.
Oh, I wanted to kill myself. Well, not literally. Well, maybe I did, but
yeah. That's horrible.
Coming from food stamps to having one of the biggest gigs in the world at that time offered to me, and working in a deli and not being able to take it.
Oh, that's terrible.
Well, at any rate, as time went on in the deli, I thought I would never play guitar again, and I conjured up enough money to get a set of Remo practice pad drums and a Ludwig Speed King pedal, and I got a book, and I started sitting in the basement. Denver has basements. I started sitting in the basement after work at night, learning to become a drummer, because I thought I could never really touch a guitar again. And this is after the I had the bandage off, but I didn't think I could actually play a guitar. I didn't play for about a year and a half.
They healed though, right?
They eventually healed. I've since been a guitar player again.
Yeah.
I came to LA as a guitar player, actually.
Right.
But during this period, I worked really, really hard every single evening. I would go down in the basement, strap on a pair of headphones with an electronic click in it, and sit there and very slowly practice drum groove patterns until after about 6 months, I became proficient enough as a drummer to start doing gigs with my old buddy Hilliard Wilson, who was the bass player from the original band I originally started this interview telling you about, from the original guys from the pre-Earth, Wind, and Fire days, and the Gerard Band as well. And I went out and I became a drummer for a local band in Denver called Network. And again, a cover band. We started doing, R&B and some jazz stuff. And I could not play I had no chops. I never professed to be a great drummer. I had very good time. That's what I had. I had nothing else but very good time. Mm-hmm. And but it was good enough to do gigs. Mm-hmm. So it was about 2 years there. I worked as a drummer in Denver, and we hired a guitar player. During that 2-year period, towards the end, my fingers had healed. I switched over. We hired a drummer, and I became the guitar player in that band.
Oh, okay.
Again. Then hooked up again with my old friend Dick Darnell, who had been producing a band called Stallion. Stallion got signed to Neil Bogart, Casablanca Records, and they had a single called Old Fashioned Boy that was a regional hit. I wound up being the guitar player in that band. This now was 77, 78 in Denver. We never really went out on tour. We played locally around that time, and did real well in town.
You were making a living.
Making a living as a musician again.
Yeah,
which was great. I had during that time I had gone through a divorce, and was living on my own, and realized that I had basically hit the ceiling of what I could accomplish in music in the Denver area. I basically had run the gamut, of all the stuff.
It was a ceiling there.
Real ceiling at that point. Everybody kept saying for years, Denver's going to be the next music explosion place. And, maybe, but not, when you compare it to a city like New York or L.A. or Nashville, it really, you could only go so far.
Right.
At that point. They had a couple of, national hit artists that came out of Denver. Well, John Denver, of course. Firefall did really, really well.
Yeah. They're still even playing.
Was it Big Head Todd and the Monsters? I think they were a band that came out of Denver that did real well later in the 80s or early 90s. But at any rate, so I finally decided to pack up and leave town. I left Denver with $34 in cash, a month's worth of food stamps, and had my Fender Telecaster and a Fender blonde Bassman guitar amp, and I had a 61 Dodge Seneca with crap hanging from the ceiling, headliner falling down in your hair. Okay.
Wow.
with an old Dodge Slant 6 engine, and I drove to L.A. in that car. And I figured, listen, if I'm going to not have any money and not have any gigs, at least it's warm in L.A. That was my thinking then.
True.
You know?
Yeah, it's a little easier to be homeless in L.A. than it is in Denver. Yeah.
So I arrived in L.A. and
did you actually come to Los Angeles?
I came to Los Angeles. I drove to Los Angeles finally in 1979. I was headed there in 70. It just took 9 years in Denver to make the final final transition. So I got to L.A. and I used my $34 in cash, and I started making phone calls, lots of phone calls, and sitting in wherever I could as a player. But at this point, you know, my chops were back as a player. So I got here as a player for sure. And I started doing, you know, sitting in with bands and I had a drummer buddy named Gary Malaber, who was the drummer from the Steve Miller Band. Mm-hmm. He played on all the Steve Miller hits, and he was working with Gerard here in L.A. as well. I rehooked up with Gerard McMahon. We did a band here. I'm jumping around a little bit here.
Okay.
But after getting some sessions in town, I wound up hooking up with this lady named Shandy Cinnamon. And we actually started doing real well in L.A. We played the Blah Blah Cafe. We played the Starwood, the Roxy, the Whiskey, all these gigs. It became a really hot band here in town. All the record labels started wanting to sign us. And the personnel in that band, it was, do you know, Pat Mastellato was our drummer.
That name is very familiar.
Yeah. Pat went on to later on. He was the founding member of one of the founding members of a band called Mr. Mister. Later on in the 80s, but we're talking 79 here now. Okay, uh-huh. We wound up getting signed to Mike Chapman, to Dreamland Records, and you're familiar with Mike Chapman.
Familiar with that? Yeah.
Oh my God, he did the Blondie, the Knack. Pat Benatar, Susie Quattro, Lita Ford. He did all those great rock acts. Mm-hmm. Like the Sweet, Barroom Blitz. He's a great writer. He was like king of the hill at that point in music history.
Yeah.
So we went into then United Western, did an album with him, and he and I. We hit it off really well in the studio. Lenise Bent, a wonderful engineer, lady engineer, engineered that album. Mike was a great producer. Mike taught me a ton. I started getting real interested in engineering at that point. During that time, I started getting hot as a player in town, and it was a wonderful thing. I wound up playing on Dusty Springfield's album. I played guitar on that with Caleb Quay. I met John Robinson because every Friday I was doing a soap called The Days of Our Lives, and JR was doing that. And
back when they used to record new music for even sitcoms
right.
and little half-hour shows.
Yeah. So this was, daytime soap, daytime television. So we did it every Friday. The composer that did it, I can't remember his last name. I'm sorry, Marty, but his name was Marty.
Okay.
And he played Fender Rhodes, and it was me on guitar, Neil Steubenhouse on bass, and John Robinson on drums.
Couldn't get good guys then.
Yeah,
huh?
right.
Yeah.
And so that's how I met John Robinson.
Yeah, cool.
Actually, the way I met Neil Steubenhouse is the band we had in Denver, Gerard, our drummer was a guy named Willie Ornelas. And when I got to L.A., Willie was one of the guys that helped me out a lot. When I got to L.A., he owned a lot of real estate because he had made a whole ton of money as a studio drummer. He used to play on the Rockford Files. He was a big TV guy. And he had me paint one of his condos as a painter. And as I was scraping a window, I was looking in the window, and Neil Steubenhouse was there practicing his bass. That's how I met Neil, through his window while I was scraping paint off of his windowsill.
See, you never know.
You never know.
Yeah.
At any rate, so as we're now in L.A., I've moved on to L.A. now. I'm getting all the session work as a player, and also getting really turned on to engineering by Mike Chapman and Lenise Bent, because what I heard coming out of those monitors when I came in, out of being a player and out in the studio, was some of the greatest stuff I ever heard in my life. The sounds were just amazing that I heard, and I kind of caught the bug. And I would ask, Mike was such an open guy, I would ask Mike, listen, how did you get that kick sound? And he would say, well, I would simply subtract here, and he had all the budget in the world at that point, and so he had plenty of time to, there wasn't a rush in making albums during those years.
No. It was common for it to take months. Yeah.
So we'd sit in the studio and he would show me things. And at that point, I had been doing all my guitar overdubs standing in the control room with all my cabling going out into the studios.
Sure.
I didn't want to do overdubs listening through headphones.
Right.
I wanted to do them, do my overdubs listening through his great monitors. So I'm always standing behind a console, and it started by osmosis. I started realizing I kind of got this. I kind of figured out this is just more sophisticated tone controls than I have on all my guitar rigs. And I was one of the early guys to make a pedal board, back in Denver, and made patch cables, of course, with guitar plugs and in a wooden frame, but still I was making pedal boards where I could cross patch different things in different orders. And I realized I was becoming an engineer without realizing it. Mm-hmm. As a lot of us musicians, I think we share that similarity.
Yeah.
Especially guitar players, well, the patch cabling and everything.
Yeah. Well, guitar players do usually know about sound.
Yeah. So that's how I kind of got into it. During that time, I was working for this Dutch filmmaker named René Dalder. He was hiring me a lot on guitar. And he had a studio on East Melrose and Hyperion, I think. Yeah, Hyperion. He had his own studio, and he had a Stevens 24-track machine.
I remember
the
those
Stevens?
Machines. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a Stevens in like a portable case. 2-inch machine. It had like that ISO.
It was a very lightweight 24-track machine.
But great machine.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like a 3M, actually.
Yeah.
The same type of except I don't think it ate tape the way a 3M did. But it sounded great like a 3M. I owned one of those at one point for a while, too.
Sure.
But he had this like 10,000 square foot room. It was an enormous room, like an airplane hangar. And a control room that was like upstairs that looked down on everything. It was like an Abbey Road kind of a looking place. And he saw that I was like really like getting into the engineering, and he was the nicest guy. And he said, listen, Steve, I'm going back to Holland to produce and direct a film for the next 9 months. If you love this place and would take care of it for me, I'll give you the keys and the alarm code. Just treat it like your own and take care of it, and I'll be back in 9 months.
Wow.
So here I have a 24-track 2-inch studio all by myself. I didn't have to book it. However, I did. I didn't have anything to do but play around in there. And he had 414s and 87s. He had mics, and he didn't really have any reverbs or anything, but it was a 10,000 square foot room. I was making my own room reverbs, and different side rooms I would use as live echo chambers, with a speaker on one end and a mic on the other, a pair of stereo mics. So I was using live chambers, and I sat and learned it, and I opened books. And now I have to admit, I was under the influence of some keep you awake substances during those years. So I would stay up all night long and read manuals and learn how to align machines. And I started becoming an engineer, as I said, by osmosis.
No.
And after 9 months, I started actually accepting gigs as an engineer. Started my I guess the beginning of my career of doing both, being a guitar player and engineer, until I realized after a while that I just couldn't do both.
Uh-huh.
And I also thought at that point that becoming an engineer, being the fact that by that time I was 33 years old, and I realized that, well, I'd had all these label deals. I was signed to Atlantic. I was signed to CBS. I was signed to Casablanca. I hadn't become a rock star yet. That was not in my genes to want that anyway, or maybe as a kid it was, but that's not what I didn't want to be famous. That was not my goal. I wanted to be good at what I did. That was,
It's amazing because you taught yourself how to play guitar, then you taught yourself how to play drums, and then you taught yourself how to be an engineer.
To be an engineer, yeah. Now, of course, I can tell you some great engineers that helped me too. I mean, Mike Chapman and Lenise Bent being a pair. I had also played guitar in the studio before that for Phil Spector.
Oh, yeah.
I did a Bobby Vinton album for Phil Spector as a player. No, but I backtracked again. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Later on, working as an engineer, I started doing demo sessions for people, Started working a lot at Artie Ripp's studio called Fidelity at Moore Park in Whitsett here in the Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of the sessions I had done. This was I believe it was Hollywood Sound.
Yeah, that's where I worked.
Hollywood
That's where
Sound,
I started.
Right? Was that it? Yeah. They had an API in there, correct?
That's correct.
If I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I think it was one of my first string dates that I ever worked on. See, that was another thing, too. A guy like me has to maintain and always will maintain my humility because I did not come through the ranks as a lot of you guys did. I didn't go, I never got coffee at a studio. I was never a runner. I was never an assistant engineer. So in a way, I missed a lot of what my peers gained by being able to sit behind brilliant engineers and soak it all in.
Well, when you came to Hollywood Sound to do that string session, approximately what year was that?
That was probably 83, 84, somewhere around then.
It's possible that we actually met there because I started there in 1976.
Okay.
But then, after a couple of years being an assistant, then I started getting my own clients, but I always came back to Hollywood Sound, and it's possible that we met
it's
there.
Possible, yeah. I do. I remember it being a pretty live room, wasn't it?
Yeah,
a real live room, and it was good
tile
for strings.
Floors and we did a lot of string sessions there. Yeah.
Well, at any rate, I had never done strings before. I told you I did some conducting in Denver, but I was not the engineer at that point. That was, in Denver, that was the time when the engineers, I didn't realize they were my friends.
Right. They were on the same team.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So here I am as an engineer. I had been introduced to Al Schmidt by a buddy named Andre Fisher many, many years ago. Okay.
Know them both, yeah.
Right. Andre was producing Dusty Springfield.
Mm-hmm.
And Andre had hired me to be a guitar player for that, as I said earlier. Well, at any rate, I'd become buddies with Al, and I figured, who can I call? Because I didn't know what to do for strings. I had never engineered a string date. I didn't know what to do, so I figured, well, who could I call? The master, Al Schmidt. I called him on the phone one night, and I said, Al, can you help me out and tell me what mics to use? What do I do? Because I'd never engineered a string date. Well, Al was gracious enough and open enough. He stayed on the phone for almost 2 hours with me, explaining in detail every microphone to use, how far to place it above the players' heads, the patterns to use, where to put everything. He just laid out everything for me, for just the whole orchestra, what to do. And I'm eternally grateful to Al for that. And, when he was having his Hollywood Star on the Walk of Fame in front of Capitol a few years back. I went there, and I was talking with him about it, about that night that he was on the phone with me. He doesn't even remember it. Okay.
Yeah. I knew Al because when Al used to come in the studio when I was still assisting there, and I assisted for Al many times. Yeah, he was a great guy. Great guy. I'll throw in a little story about Al Schmidt.
Yeah, go on.
You remember, back in those days, if you were the engineer and there was a producer, the producer was king.
Yeah.
Producer,
sure.
You didn't walk into the studio in the morning and say, hey, Mr. Producer, what time are we going to be finished today?
Yeah.
You never said that.
No.
Not especially if it was an open-end session as far as the studio was concerned.
Yeah.
You didn't ask to leave or say, hey, I've got a dinner date at 5 or something. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget sitting there, I'm working with Al, and I can't remember what the session was. But
right.
He says, he looks at his watch, he turns to the producer and says, hey, it's getting to be 5 o'clock. I got a dinner reservation, 5:30.
Who said this? Al?
Al.
Yeah.
I was like sitting there just looking at him, just stunned.
Yeah.
It's like, really, I never saw an engineer or a player or anybody tell the producer, hey, we got to finish up the session because I got a dinner reservation,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But Al was, he was one of the king engineers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he was also, before that, a king producer as well.
Yes, of course.
Don't forget he did produce the Jefferson Airplane.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Oh, and he told me stories about them. They used to used to dose him with acid.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Did they really?
That's what he told me.
Oh,
it's one of his stories he told.
Yeah.
Sitting behind the console, saying that he'd be sitting there, and all of a sudden it'd start to feel weird, and he'd go, "Oh shit! They dosed me again.
They dosed me."
So anyway,
that's great.
Go on.
That's great.
I throw in a couple Al Schmidt
the
stories
string section, the string session, it was a wonderful success. Thanks to Al.
Yeah.
And at that point, till this day, I use his techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Developed a few of my own in the meantime.
Of course. Sure you have. Yeah. So then you continued on?
I continued on. Now, mind you, producing this lady named Linda McCrary, or I should say co-producing, working with her. And I was working at a studio then. It was called Spindletop.
I remember that
Remember
name.
that? It was an all MCI room.
I don't remember where it was or anything, but I do remember the name.
It was on Cahuenga. It was near, remember Britannia?
Yeah.
Right near Universal City there?
Britannia Row, it was called Britannia Row, right?
I think so.
That was on Cahuenga.
Yeah, on Cahuenga.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Universal City.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this was up the street from that.
Okay.
But at any rate, I was working there with Linda, and these guys came from Miami. She had gotten signed to a label in Miami, a label called TSOM, The Sound of Miami. They loved her and wanted to put out a record with her. They also loved me. They offered me a job as the chief engineer / head of A&R for this label in Miami. And I moved there the year of 83.
You moved back to Miami?
I moved to Miami. I'd never been to Miami. I moved there.
Oh.
Okay. They offered me what seemed like a very lucrative position, and I helped install a new console. They had a beautiful room there. I won't get too deep into that, but they turned out to be big criminals.
Oh.
Okay. Which is why they had all that money.
Yeah, it was all cash.
Okay. After I found out what was going on, I hightailed it back to L.A. and kissed the ground. That's all I'll say about that year.
That's a good. How you were there for a year?
I was there for most of the year.
And did you get paid?
I got paid.
Okay,
yeah,
well,
I got paid.
So it wasn't that bad then.
No, it wasn't that bad. As a matter of fact, I traveled the world with the president of the label. Traveled the world. I mean, I went to Italy, Germany, just all over France, England. We went to meet him. We were making publishing deals, and it just turned out, I found out that after we got back, he didn't own the publishing he was selling. Okay. I won't use any names in this, though.
All right.
Okay.
That's fair.
All right.
So you came back to L.A., and
I
then
came
what
back
happened?
to L.A., kissed the ground, and immediately I got a gig with Nick Gilder.
Oh,
You
Nick
remember
Gilder,
Hot Child in the City, Nick Gilder?
Yeah.
Okay. He hired me to play guitar for his album on RCA. So I wound up, being his guitar player on this album.
Well, he was a guitar player, right?
Yeah, a bit of a guitar player.
Yeah.
But mainly a frontman, singer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I've left out a whole bunch of stuff, Ross. I went out on the Van Halen tour earlier in '79, Robert Fleischman Band.
Really?
I'm skipping a whole lot of stuff here because there's too much. I should have written it down before my interview with you.
Well, that's okay. Think of what you can think of, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, okay. Well, at any rate, so I did Nick Gilder's album. It was his bomb album, unfortunately.
All right.
It didn't go anywhere. But during that time, while I was making the album, I was also getting hired a lot as an engineer. So I was like wearing two hats at once, and I was really busy being a guitar player in the studio and getting called for engineer gigs. So I started working with this R&B duo named Renee and Angela, and I was engineering their stuff, and their producer was a guy named Bobby Watson, bass player from Rufus. Remember Bobby? Mm-hmm. He and I became good buddies, and we were doing this whole album with them at Renee's studio and at Westlake as well. And Bruce Swedien wound up mixing the album, but I had recorded everything on it. While sitting in the studio working with Nick Gilder, it turns out that all of a sudden the singles went to #1. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the first #1 record I've ever had, and it's as an engineer, not as a musician.
Wow.
And I started realizing at that point, you know what? Maybe it's time to change my business card from guitar player to engineer. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of like the turning point for me when I realized that I should become an engineer as a career because it seemed more stable at that time.
At that time, yeah, it was very lucrative, and there was lots of work.
Yeah,
there was plenty of work.
Yeah, and all of a sudden I was having success. Mm-hmm. As an engineer. Even though I didn't mix the album, it didn't matter. I was the engineer that recorded the whole thing. Yeah, and so it was a major credit for me. I'm really screwing up the timeline here because I'm forgetting that when I came back from Miami also, I got a gig mixing the TV show every week, Miami Vice.
Oh, okay. So you had a little TV experience too.
Yeah.
As a production mixer.
Yeah. So again, my timeline is vague. And it's only vague.
It's a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, a long time ago.
We always think it's just only a few years ago, but it was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago, yeah. Yeah, that was over 30 years ago now.
Yeah.
Holy smokes.
Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it?
Yeah. So here I am. I got a big R&B hit with Renee and Angela. Then I went on to do the Isley Brothers. Then I'm doing Miami Vice. And the Isley Brothers I actually recorded and mixed. Then I did Brenda Russell's album with Piano in the Dark on it. And I just started getting hot as an engineer.
And you were working at just various studios?
Yeah, all over town.
Working
all over town, yeah. There was another fateful day. I was still thinking I could play guitar on sessions at the same time. I think at that point it was the Coke speaking, thinking I could do everything and stay up all night, God bless America. I've been clean and sober for so many decades now. But anyway, during that time, I remember I got called to engineer a session and then do the guitar overdubs on it. And it was for some demos for I forgot who the artist was now. And it was at Mike McDonald's studio called Tracks in West L.A., different Mike McDonald.
Uh-huh. Okay, I remember that studio too. Yeah. Tracks. TRAX, I think they spelled it.
TRAX, right, exactly. And I'd finished cutting the tracks with the whole rhythm section except minus guitar. And I remember picking up my guitar, and I hadn't played in months. And I picked it up and realized that after a lifetime at that point of being a guitar player, it wasn't there. I could not find the groove. And It was embarrassing, but at the same time, I said, you know what, guys? I just don't have it. You're going to have to get a guitar player for this. And it was at that point I put down the guitar. And I put down the guitar for 28 full years.
Wow.
I mean, I didn't even come out of the case. It was a bit embarrassing because it was always there, like turning on a faucet. My pocket was always there. My intonation was it was always there for me my whole life, from being a young from being an adolescent, and then all of a sudden in my 30s it was gone. So I put it down and I just stuck to engineering all the rest of the time. And that's, during that time, that's when I wound up with Miami Vice and Brenda Russell and the Isleys, and then Robert Folk, the movies. I did Police Academy with him. I did, then I wound up doing the Stanley Clarke. I did his 2 big solo albums with him. We reunited here in L.A. He produced a couple of tunes on Brenda Russell's album. The album was called Get Here. Get Here wound up being a big single for the song that Brenda wrote, became a big single for Oleta Adams later. Get Here If You Can. I'm sure you remember it. And then I did Stanley. I said, If This Bass Could Only Talk, and then another album with him called East River Drive. Then we did a TV show together called A Man Called Hawk. And I did some work on Boys in the Hood, on that movie with him, Boys in the Hood. And What's Love Got to Do with It, the Ike and Turner story. Then we did Poetic Justice with Janet Jackson. I had a good run with Stanley.
Yeah, sounds like it, yeah.
That brought us around up until like 93, during which time I met Rick Braun.
And you started getting into like the smooth jazz
stuff,
yeah.
Right. When I was working with Stanley, the late 80s and early 90s, the format wasn't called smooth jazz. It was called Quiet Storm at that point.
Right. Yeah, actually, that was what they were calling certain shows that were on the radio.
Quiet Storm.
Yeah.
And they were
DJ
doing kind of
like
real
deep voice,
kind of like jazzy funk kind of stuff, and wound up being called smooth jazz later.
Yeah.
Which to me is really just kind of like instrumental R&B.
Yeah. There was another term, contemporary jazz.
Contemporary jazz,
Because somebody else I interviewed said, I was doing the contemporary jazz before it was called smooth jazz.
So very shortly after I mixed the very last episode of Miami Vice, I did the last 2 seasons. It was a Cherokee. I mixed that. A week later, I wound up mixing Rick Braun's first album for Mesa Blue Moon. In that studio, and then wound up, doing the smooth jazz thing for smooth jazz and then Latin. There wound up a lot of Latin stuff.
Yeah.
Also, during that time, and at that point, then my wife Sarah started working for a producer named Casey Porter, who is a fairly heavyweight Latin producer. He was doing Ricky Martin, Los Fabulosos Cadillacs, Anita Nazario, and I wound up with gold records for all these guys. I wound up mixing for him. And Sarah, becoming tired of the engineering, wound up being his production coordinator.
There was a call for production coordinators back then.
Yeah.
Because producers were so busy.
Yeah,
they'd have 2 or 3 projects going on at the same time.
As he was. And so
they needed somebody to keep track of the paperwork and pay people and do all that
And she really,
stuff.
at that point, loved the idea of being able to go home at 5:30.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
After years of her engineering and being home at all hours, So that's kind of...
Then you worked for David Benoit, and you worked for
I wound up
lot
with Rick,
jazz guys.
A lot of jazz guys during that time.
And from what we've talked about before we started the interview, was you're still kind of in that genre. You're doing a lot of that.
It wound up being a really, really nice genre for me. And,
you also... we talked about this because I mostly do live sound now.
Right.
You do studio sound, but you did go out on the road and do a little. You did some live sound.
Yeah, I did a bit of live sound.
Tell us about that.
Yeah,
because you had a pretty interesting story about
yeah,
that.
let's see which one. Yeah, the first one I did was a singer-songwriter named Ned Doheny. Ned Doheny, just to give you a little bit of background, he wrote the song "What You Gonna Do for Me" that Shaka Khan had with Rufus. He wrote, I forget the titles of the other songs, but 3 or 4 of his tunes became big records for the Average White Band. And Ned became almost a household name in Japan as an artist himself. He's had many albums out. I went out, and he and I became buddies because I recorded and mixed a solo album of his, where I met Sarah, actually, at Topanga Skyline, making his album. And I wound up going out and I did the live sound for him, which was a lot of fun. My first experience going to Japan and working in studios. We did some actual tracking dates besides live in the studio in Japan.
Oh, how fun.
And his band was the great Carlos Vega, rest in peace, on drums. Mike Baccaro, another wonderful guy that passed away.
Sure.
Jay Winding on keyboards.
Yeah.
James Hara on guitar, who I still see, great guitar player.
Oh, great band.
Yeah, great band. Leslie Smith singing, and Marilyn Scott singing backgrounds, and Maxanne Lewis singing backgrounds.
It's amazing you remember all these people's names.
I know.
So you didn't do that much damage back in the 70s.
No, not yeah. Well, this was
already.
Remember
a lot of names.
Yeah. This was already the 90s. I was recovered by then.
Okay.
So that was the first trip. That was a lot of fun. I was amazed in Japan how perfect they got my miking. After the first, like we were talking about earlier, after the very first show, the rest is cake because all the other engineers, that you're working with, the sound guys, they set up everything on the next date just like you had it the night before.
Exactly. Yeah, so much fun.
Yeah. So that was the first foray into Japan. Then a few years later, I did it again with Marilyn Scott for her solo project. But then later on in 94, this was a big one I did. I went out with the Jay Graydon, who is a buddy of mine, as you know Jay and his background.
Yeah, fantastic studio guitar player.
Yeah. Well, my God, he played the guitar solo on Peg, Steely Dan. He's played many memorable.
Oh, absolutely.
Transcribed solos that people have been trying to copy for years, and he produced all the greatest Al Jarreau hits.
Monster.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Manhattan Transfer, as you worked with, right?
Yeah.
At any rate, he hit me up to go out and do his live shows because he knew he wanted a studio guy to do it. So I went and I rehearsed with the band for most of a month over at Third Encore. And learned all the moves, and that band. Should I tell you the names of everybody in that band?
Sure, go ahead.
It was Tris Imboden on drums, Kenji Sano on bass. The guitar lineup was, of course, Jay Graydon, Sherwood Ball, and Ned Doheny on guitar, and the 3 of them singing. Also, Joseph Williams singing, who was a singer in Toto, and also John Williams' son.
Yes.
Jay Oliver playing keyboards, and Bill Cantos playing keyboards. And all of these guys singing up a storm. It was a great band. Lots of vocals and lots of instruments to do live.
Yeah.
So the problem with this particular tour for me was the fact that I came down with the flu a couple of days before I got on the plane, and the tour consisted of all of Japan, all of Sweden, and all of Norway, and we left on like January 25th, and we were gone for like 5 weeks, all into February, and
wow. That's not fun being sick on the road.
No.
Not at all.
Needless to say, I got on the plane. I already had like 101, 102 fever, and I couldn't breathe, and I was just dying. It's such a shame because for everybody else but me, everybody says that was such great fun and it sounded so great. I'm so blessed that I was able to make it sound good through my flu, but I couldn't enjoy any of it. And I was seeing doctor after doctor in every city we went to, trying to see if there was any, magic pill that I could take, antibiotics. But, it was like it was a flu virus. Nothing could cure me but bed rest, which is what you don't get.
You don't get that on the road.
Flying,
no.
and it was all,
and you're flying everywhere.
We were flying everywhere.
Yeah.
So it was flight after flight and jet lag after jet lag, to different countries and not getting any rest and being in a hotel for, sleeping for 4 hours and then a lobby call. You know the routine.
Yeah.
You've done it.
Oh, yeah.
And trying to sweat it out of me in the bathtub and hotel rooms.
Oh, God. That's terrible. And you were sick the whole time.
I was sick the whole time for the whole tour.
That's amazing because usually, the flu usually doesn't last more than a couple of weeks.
Well, the reason it lasted is because I couldn't get any rest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
It just hung on because I could not get any rest, and it was a major hustle every gig.
Yeah.
And
at the end of the tour, you said...
Yeah, at the end of the tour, I came back, and I was sick in bed for like 6 weeks at home. I contracted the Epstein-Barr virus because my resistance was like so low from doing that, So I kind of permanently damaged myself. But, the things we do for
the career, right?
For our craft, for our career. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you came back and you said you never wanted to go on the road
I don't want to go on the road again, no.
Well, that's good because I don't need any more competition out there. Wow.
Do you ever run into our mutual buddy Eric Zobler? You know Eric?
No.
Eric engineered for George Duke for many years and he made many, many hit records himself as an engineer. Him. He goes out a lot. He went out with George for quite a while.
Uh-huh.
Unfortunately, I don't know who he goes out with now. I should know because I see him at our Burbank lunches. Do you ever do the audio lunches?
No.
You should sometime.
Never been invited.
Well, I'll invite you. I'll ask Peter Dell to invite you.
Okay, sure.
You should come to the audio lunches.
Sure.
They're,
when I'm home, I'm.
Yeah. They're Wednesdays at noon. You should come. Absolutely.
Yeah,
You're one of the cats, man.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
I'd love to do that. Yeah.
We just lost, as you know, Jeff Emmerich.
Yeah.
Jeff's been there. Al Schmidt shows up. Also, Clark Germain shows up. We all,
Oh, okay.
All sorts of people. Jack Douglas. I could go on and on and on. Mick Guzowski. We all.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'd like to actually. Mick is one of those people. I knew Mick back from days at Hollywood Sound. He used to work there sometimes.
Yeah.
And
sure.
I've been trying to contact him to do this.
I've been trying to have coffee with him for the last year.
I don't think he responds very, very well.
Well, he does every now and then. I went to a barbecue at his house like a summer. 2 summers ago now, and we've been trying to hook up ever since. But God bless America, we're busy.
Yeah, well, it's nice.
That's a great thing.
That's really good, and you're still busy.
I'm still busy. I'm very busy right now.
That's great. And what are you working on?
Right now, I'm in the process. I'm in the midst of doing a new Keiko Matsui album.
Okay, cool.
With
worked with her once too.
Yeah,
yeah.
What
did a live show with her and David Benoit.
Right.
Did a little 2 piano
thing. What a brilliant talent.
And sweetheart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the band is drums, Vinnie Caluta, bass, Jimmy Johnson, guitar, Paul Jackson Jr. and Tim Pierce.
Wow.
Arranging strings and keyboard, Randy Waldman.
Wow.
Percussion, Luis
cats,
Conti.
For sure.
And this is all recorded live. And Jimmy Branley, her band drummer, who's a killer drummer, one of the newer guys on the scene, a genius drummer, in the league of Vinny and JR. And going to kill me, her guitar player, JP, I got to look it up, and the bass player, Rico, and I forget their last names. I just met them, so they're not real familiar to me, but they're also genius players. JP and Rico, forgive me, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Everybody will go out and buy the album, and they can see them on the credits.
Yeah, but they're brilliant guitar and bass player. At any rate, so I'm working on that. I got a string and horn date Monday for them. I just finished doing all the basic tracks at United and Studio A on the big Focus right there. The stuff sounds great. I'm working at 96K 32-bit on everything. Immediately following Keiko, I'm working on an Al Jarreau tribute album with Larry Williams, which is going to be a cast of a bunch of great vocalists. I'm not at liberty to say all the names right now, but probably everybody you know that you have worked with. And it's the Al Jarreau, all the band members, including Larry Williams, put together a Kickstarter campaign to make this album. And within a very short time, within a matter of weeks, they met their goal to make the album. So they've hired me to mix it. I mixed Al Jarreau's Christmas album years ago, as you probably saw, and I've been working on stuff with Larry Williams for years, and so I'm going to be doing that right after this, including more tracks for David Garfield's new album, which is now up for numerous categories for this year's Grammy. Then right behind that is a new David Benoit Marc Antoine. Again, at the same studio. I'm going to be working United Studio A for that. That'll carry me into January. It is now, to know the date of this podcast, today is, what date?
Well, today's October 18th.
October 18th.
That we're recording this. And
yeah.
I'll be putting this out soon, in the next week or two. Yeah.
So this will take me into January. Well into January, and then I have a Japanese album for a well-known drummer there named Satoshi Bando. I'll be doing his new album over at LAFX, the Vicari studio, on that beautiful API over there.
Nice.
And that's what I'm looking at so far right now. I got my work cut out for me, and I'm
fantastic.
mixing everything out of my room, at my place.
You have a studio at your house?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mix room.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And you have a console, or you?
Yeah, I have
Pro Tools.
I got 48 outputs of Pro Tools. No, I'm sorry, 56 outputs of Pro Tools, going to a Yamaha DM2000 console, which is their flagship digital desk, and I do a hybrid mixing. I mix partially in Pro Tools. I use a lot of the Pro Tools EQ. I use a lot of the Fab Filter stuff and wave stuff, and I use automation, of course, in Pro Tools. And but I have I have LA2As, Summits, 1176s, analog, 2016 analog reverb, the Eventide stuff. I got a bunch of analog stuff that are on inserts of my console, which are retrofitted with Apogee send and return for the D to A to Ds to go to my analog gear. So I'll use the console automation, analog gear, Pro Tools automation. Sometimes I mix on the box. Sometimes I mix straight to the console. It's always different depending on the project. And I got the best of both worlds doing it that way.
Yeah, sure sounds like it. That's great, Steve. Yeah. Well, I'm happy for you that you're busy.
So it's a blessing.
Really good.
I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful
deserve it.
To be getting to work with these wonderful people.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, that brings us up to today.
Today,
see, we did it. We told your whole life story here, and
I left a lot out, but we don't have an afternoon.
Well, you've got too
much.
much.
We need a few beers and
Wow. Well, listen, Steve, I sure appreciate you coming out here to talk with me and participate in my project.
Well, my pleasure. I'm sure. I hope I haven't been too long-winded with all this or jumped around too much.
No. It's perfect. It's great. It's been a real pleasure. You had a lot to say because you've done a lot. You have a real interesting life. Yeah. You've had a really good, interesting, and good career, and I'm happy for you.
Well, thanks. I'm happy to finally get to meet you.
Yeah,
in person. We've kind of crossed paths over the last 3 decades.
Absolutely, yeah.
I never actually got to sit down like this.
Yeah, it's been fun. All right, Steve. So we're going to say goodbye.
Okay.
And once again, thank you very much, Steve.
My pleasure.
All right. Bye bye.
Thanks, Ross.
The Rossaround Backstage Podcast wants to thank my good friend Tim Hines for the original music that you are listening to now. We are currently looking for sponsors for the Rossaround Backstage Podcast so that we can continue to bring you interesting stories like the one you just heard. I can be reached through Facebook or email me at rosspallone.com. Thank you for listening.